Yeah, it is being recorded.
Yeah, I think we can start reviewing the things that we left off on the previous two chapters.
Oh boy, I'm not ready for that. I mean, let's see. I mean, there wasn't really that much there. It was defining epistemology.
Right.
Um, and he noted that epistemology is it's not really just like one thing. It's psychology and metaphysics
Right.
together. And
Which that particular definition is dealt with very thoroughly in the second part of this book. Yeah.
right. And I think he also kind of introduces us to the critical problem a little bit with respect to how knowledge or how idealists start with thought and realists start with being. And that becomes a really critical part of the third chapter and the fourth as well.
Right. And which is mostly dealing with that first definition that was presented in the first chapter, which is that understanding epistemology from the historical, which is that in relation to the critical problem, which came in, which was birthed by Descartes' endeavor to try to ground certainty and knowledge. Yeah, these are like and this is something that's going to be dealt with, yeah, very a lot in this third chapter, as to what is going on there, what is actually going on in sort of the idealist route, um, and as a first principle, and where does that, what are the implications of that a bit there? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the insights that he came up with out of many was the fact that what Descartes did in kind of like searching for certainty was he tried to find that thought because, you know, well, there's a lot of things. I
Yeah,
guess
he
you're going to
wanted
go over,
to.
it, but
I think fundamentally was that what Wilhelmsen pointed out was that Descartes wanted to find an axiom, something, a principle that can be that can be applied to every fields of knowledge, and so it wouldn't be just philosophy on its own, but like the physical sciences and any other field that you know has to do with something with knowledge and all that in general. So an axiom that he can that is universal, to say, which is something that is a bit odd with the scholastic tradition, which doesn't necessarily put forward that like there's this universal axiom in which like this is how we ground certainty at all. But that was Descartes' endeavor to try um, try to find that principle, a universal principle that can be applied to every field that regards itself with knowledge. And he ended up coming with the cogito, which is that like a being and like thought is being, and that is the first principle, which is what defines a lot of the idealist traditions here onward and all that. And the other thing that I wanted to point out before getting through it is I think the way that he's using idealism is a bit loosely here, because although he does mention Kant, Hegel, Fichte, Schlegel, and all that, all these people, like, he doesn't necessarily say that like they're just like undifferentiated from one another, and also that like using the term idealism is kind of just to denote that most of these people are coming from the same place, even though they diverge exactly as to the conclusions on their approach to what is quote unquote epistemology. Because yeah, as already mentioned, epistemology is really something that comes about when you postulate something of like a dichotomy of the body and mind, and sort of this this thing, this sort of a dichotomy in which like knowledge becomes kind of like the center of the question, as how is it bridged and all that. Like that's where epistemology came from. That is the critical problem, which in this chapter and the previous one like before, Williamson just said that this is not an issue within the scholastic tradition or the Thomistic tradition to be specific here, because there was never this, the postulating of like a dichotomy of the body and mind, in which like there's like an issue of like knowledge here and all that. And we'll get into it as to what is the reason why in this chapter, but he ended up in the note in the second chapter, like saying that like what he's describing here is non-critical realism or metaphysical realism and all that, as opposed to critical realism, which concerns itself with the critical problem of the bridging of the body and mind. Yeah.
Well, so one thing I would want to note is I think he's taking this kind of definition of idealism from Gil Sun. If
Right.
I have a video where I just kind of like read out his handbook, realist beginner's handbook, and he there basically the way he defines idealism is those who start out with thought, and realists are those who start out with being as their starting point. And so, I mean, they may not be like idealists in the sense that they think that like everything is ideas necessarily, or that there's no such thing as a material reality. But they are idealists in the sense that their first principle is ideas or just thoughts, and that's where they start from, and then they try to bridge that. Some of them try to bridge the gap between ideas and reality.
Right. And let me just add one more thing before we go along, because I was actually talking about this a bit with a friend of mine in regards to like what is the point of like having like this discussion about idealism versus realism and all that, and like if this is just seems to be kind of like a more just a seems like a purely academic and like a sort of thing to do, which I told him that it's like, well, yeah, it can be something like that, but usually you know to be like a realist or to be an idealist, it's not just like something that people like go through it academically. People can come to such an understanding of things just through conditioning. And what I mean by that is that like your experience and the social and everything like that can condition you into thinking about things in a very specific way. And so like you'll and depending also on the language that you're participating in, you can come like to understand things very relativistically, which is something that I point out about idealism, that there's a tendency of idealism to kind of think about things very relativistic, like a relativist. um, Not that all idealists will fall onto discussing things or talking about things like that. I mean, you have, for example, absolute idealists, which don't necessarily have to like talk about things very relativistically. Some actually talk about things a bit, like in a historicist approach. There's that. But anyway, it's like I told that you can fall into either a realist or an idealist camp just through like the conditioning of the way that you were taught to perceive things. The way that we speak about things and all that. I mean, even the concept of like using the words like worldview, like that is intrinsically like intrinsically modern on its own. That's not something that you can't really fit that into like a say a Thomistic framework, the idea of a worldview, because that assumes that like people have like this perception of things that is like a construction of their own and all that, and that is more at home with an idealist framework rather than a realist framework. That was the thing I was trying to explain to my friend about it. It's like you can fall. You don't have to go through these things on an academic sort of approach, whatever, like that. Yeah,
Yeah,
you
no,
can be conditioned.
I I agree, but also, I mean, if you're I deal with atheists a lot. If you deal with them, they're going to go down the skeptical route. And Wilhelmson actually, in the fourth chapter, which you said you didn't. I guess you've read it before, but you didn't read it this recently. Um, he points out people who deny the law of non-contradiction. Uh, a lot of them are just doing so because they're afraid of the implications of allowing absolute truth to to exist, right? Um, and I I think a lot of atheists do this as well. Though I mean, recently I was talking to somebody named Dr. Theo, and he was denying the law of the excluded middle because it was going to lead him to a conclusion that he didn't like. Ultimately, we were arguing about the existence of God as well, and I'm sure he's. I think that's probably also coming out of fear, and I think a lot of so even though yeah, it's kind of like an academic discussion, a lot of people will go down this sort of skeptical route of idealism, um, in order to just to uh, deny any of your arguments in favor of like any position, really, not only theism. I mean, this can also be seen in like transgenderism and uh, all sorts of different political topics as well.
Yeah, and so that's kind of like the thing I notice about, like, you can approach these things in different avenues, but like there's a tendency of like going from either in this camp or the other camp and all that. People sometimes, at least people who are interested in things like philosophy of mind, tend to think about the dichotomies between idealism and materialism, which I think it's that's just its own camp within the philosophy of mind, and one that doesn't really speak as to like in relation to everything other other areas and all that, especially that the whole of metaphysics and even like you know other applications like ethics and all that. But yeah, I would say that like really the dichotomy really comes in, at least in the metaphysical discussions. It will be like really on realism and idealism rather than idealism and materialism, because I would, and this is something that I hope to maybe like able to show in discussing this chapter, is that idealism and materialism are just kind of like variations within idealism itself and all that. And this is something that Facer like pointed out in his book on the introduction of the philosophy of mind. Um, uh, yeah, so like yeah, but anyway, like, yeah, I think we can just start like like getting
Yeah,
through like the subsections of this third chapter at least.
yeah, sure.
Yeah, so in the previous chapter, as mentioned, we kind of left it off on like a basic definition of metaphysical realism, which is that as opposed to critical realism, critical realism being that of that or the critical problem, which is yeah, no, not critical realism, just the critical problem really, like epistemology emerge out of like the considerations of the critical problem, which was given by Descartes in his postulating of the cogito. And then you get to the question is how do we come to know things if like if you have thought and you have like those things outside of thought. And anyway, so metaphysical realism, as was given in the previous chapter, was like one that doesn't concern itself with this question because it doesn't postulate the cogito as like the first of principles. That's the first thing that that comes into the order of things, and actually, it will be being. Things themselves will be coming as the first of order. So, like being is will be the first, the principle for a metaphysical realist. You know. So, so this is really the point of departure, pointed out by Wilhelmsen in regards to epistemology, and so so the metaphysical realist doesn't have like this problem of the sort of like the bridging of the body and mind. And so the question exactly comes afterwards is like like is that something that like that can be tenable, or is this something that or is the metaphysical realist ignoring a problem that is there for its own like uh, for its own like ad hoc sort of justification and all that.
Right. I mean, the specific thing he asked is if so Thomists are going to start out with, and realists in general, with being and that things exist. And so the question that, or the accusation of the idealist is going to be, okay, well, you're just not answering the question. You're just assuming is the word that he used, or postulating um, that there is such a thing as reality. And so he deals with that question of, are we just like basically assuming that reality exists by starting with reality, or is something else going on there?
Yeah, and before you can talk about like the metaphysical realist, um, a sort of assertion, quote unquote, of reality as like just being there. He goes on to exactly like particularly how do you say what is going on, what is being done here? Is it things are being assumed or postulated, or are things are they just kind of like evident on their own and all that? And so he goes into assumption. Assumption is basically something that is like uh, that whatever is stated, its opposite can also be equally valid, and so and that's I'm trying to recall if that was the exact definition. Do you remember that this section of it?
It was something like that. Basically, that there's not really any evidence in favor of the contrary. So, if being were such that you're just purely postulating that things exist, and the opposite conclusion is also just as evident, which basically means there's no evidence either way. It's not evident that things exist, and it's not evidence that things do not exist. In that case, then it's a pure assumption or a postulation or
Right.
postulate.
Right, and then I think he will go on after talking about evident propositions and like proof propositions, right?
Correct. Yes. So Wilhelmson's position is going to be, well, it's not an assumption because it is evident that things exist. It's not it's, the idea that uh, things do not exist is not equally likely. And he also, so he basically defines the idea of self evidence, which is that in grasping the uh, thing, or what being is, you understand that what you're grasping is true, or that, yeah, might not be the exact words that you should use, but you grasp that it's true um, immediately. And so it's an optimistic philosophy, intuition, it's the immediate grasp of something as true. So basically, no assumption because it's the evidence that things exist. And nobody really doubts this. I mean, he talks about something in the fourth chapter that people can signify that they doubt these things. They can say they doubt the law of non contradiction. They can say that they doubt that things exist. But if you actually look at their activity, they can't act in that way. It's not something that you can actually be a lived reality. In order to act, if you act at all, you're contradicting your claim, which your language signifies, um, but you're actually contradicting it in your actions by even acting in the first place. Um, and so yeah, there are people who claim that these things are not evident, and claim to doubt it, but in their actions, they evidently don't. At least, like with respect to their activity. Um, and really, if you think about, so the way I think about it is, so you you can't have an infinite regress of proving things to be true. So you can't say, okay, we know this exists because we have this evidence, and then this evidence exists. We know that exists because of this evidence, and so on and so forth. Because you're going to end up with a vicious regress. So you actually have to start out with first principles that are evident, And the idealists actually agree with us on that technically, because they start out with they just start out with thoughts instead of without with being, and they it's very sneaky the way that they go about this because they always assume these things. Whenever they say, for example, that you could be a brain in the vat, well, they're assuming there that it's possible for you to be a brain in the vat, and they'll say, oh well, it's not logically contradictory, but they're assuming there that anything that is logically not contradictory is you know possible. And so they themselves are also starting out with basic assumptions and ultimate principles. They're just reducing it to thoughts instead of being, and we're just starting out with being. That's the difference between realists and idealists. We start out with being, and they start out with thoughts.
Yeah. And from here on, like Williamson points out that there's a reason as to why is that they go around this um, way of sort of structuring like the way that we grasp knowledge, which is that of like an implicit, um, and he uses the term Platonism to describe this, which is that of like having this um, dichotomy of the body and mind, in which what the mind attains is separate from what the body attains, or the senses specifically for the body. And like I don't like using the word Platonism to describe this because I think it's kind of being used a bit loosely in this occasion. I think maybe Willison did talk about that a bit, but yeah, it's yeah. So he uses it, like that. There's this implicit Platonism of understanding the body and mind as like grasping things on their own, in which it is the reason why you have like this uh, way of putting the cogito as something that grasps abstract things, and the senses just grasp things that are sensible. That's it. And like these and the sort of like both seem to be like incapable of communicating it from this framework of things. Yeah, and yeah, so yeah, Wilson. That's where kind of Wilson goes on.
Yeah. So yeah, I have a quote in. It's really insightful. I think he says that the critical school drops both the thing known and the knower. It retains only pure knowing and thinking. Um, and I thought that's interesting because that's what they're actually doing whenever because they're separating the body um, from the intellect, right? And they're saying, okay, so I thought this was really insightful the way that he explained this. They do that by separating senses and thoughts, and they say, okay, well, there's these senses and sensations, and there's these thoughts, and these are two separate things. We have to consider them uh, differently, right? But what Wilhelmson points out is that our concepts do not tell us, first of all, that things are that they exist. They only tell us what they are, or their essence or nature. That's what our concepts, our intellect does, and our senses. They don't tell us that things exist either. They just tell us. They just say red or blue or smelly or whatever, right? It gives us sensations. Um, but it doesn't tell us whether those sensations exist. And so he says also in another place that things exist, therefore, is known neither by the intellect nor the senses. And so, if you're taking like this idealist approach of like, oh well, there's these two separate things, and uh, there's thoughts and then there's sensations, and you're like, okay, but there's neither of those tell us that things exist. And then you end up with this position where you can't even know that things exist at all, because that's all you have. You have thoughts and you have sensation. Um, but right, so Wilhelmsen says, okay, basically this is ignoring the Thomistic or Aristotelian idea of hylomorphism, where there's not these two separate things; they join together in unity, body and soul, um, and they actually form one human person. And the human person isn't just soul, it isn't just the body, it's this soul and the body as one, and that's what makes a human person. And so it's only as a human person, or as this unity between body and soul, that you can know things that know that things exist. That's uh, where it comes from. It comes from the unity of sensation and thought. Uh, and so I thought that was really insightful. Do you have any thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, like very. He puts it in this way in one sentence, like man knows what he senses and senses what he knows. Like these things are not just operations that you can consider one without the other, as you elaborated there. The idea that that you can think about like in pure intellect and pure senses is really something that is like what happens when you have like this like quasi platonic understanding of man, as like these two things, and which like knowledge is kind of like grasped from either the mind or the senses. And what happens is that you either tend to fall into like these either elevating the mind or elevating the senses. The elevating the mind would entail something like absolute idealism, which is like like you can there is no such thing as like an external reality on its own. It's really just the construction of the mind and all that. Uh, that's something that you'll find in absolute idealism. Although you find also two trends within it, which is that of objective and subjective idealism and all that. Which one is about like that reality is like an individual like is due to like an individual mind's construction, while like objective idealism is due to spirit, um, which is not just like about on the individual. And the other tendency of like elevating the senses or the body would be something more of like Kantianism or critical idealism, for that matter. Yeah, he's at least he points out to these like two tendencies of like having this sort of strict dichotomy, or I would say just exclusivity of like the mind or body and all that. And yeah, it's while like the Thomist position, as he elaborated, is really kind of understanding these things as a unity, and it's not like you can, like the mind or the senses come to know you know, come to know existence. Um, Actually, existence just escapes conceptualization. Really, existence is not something that is contained within like our within concepts, which is something that he'll elaborate on later chapters on later. And that's another key area in which why like contemporary modern philosophers uh, tend to like fall into error, which is that the idea of like categorizing existence or being as among like other like concepts. Yeah, that's a very key, another key area of like the point of departure, as alongside other things here. Yeah, and so yeah, so the Thomistic position is that man knows what he senses and senses what he knows, or that man knows that there are things because he senses them. That's how he ended on that note on the Thomistic position.
Right. And I think the next section uh, goes into the question of how do we know that we know anything if we have false perceptions, or if if our perceptions can be deceived. Do you want to go over that part?
Yeah, I would. I think I also might have skipped on another thing, a very key thing, which is that which is in regards to the cogito, which we touched a bit about it, like the idea of like an abstract thought, like abstracted from the person itself, and the act of knowing also abstracted from like the person itself, which is that like it is just just let me see if I can elaborate a bit on that. It is really an impossible thing to do, and this is the problem with like having the cogito as like the first principle, which is that on its own, it tends to like have this abstraction of man from thought, and the action and man from the action of like of knowing, you know, and yeah, this is like not something that you even properly conceive of, which the idealist would try like to chalk up as like just a psychological criticism or something like that. But it is, a valid criticism of it. It's like, where is this sort of like a, what is this sort of like abstraction of like pure thought and like pure action and all that? He actually demonstrates this in regards to the grammar of existence at one point. Like, there's no such thing as a verb that is like doesn't part like that is purely on its own. It usually has to be in participation with something and all that. Like, there is no such thing as flight on its own. It's flight is participating within something and all that. And so like thought, is participating in something. It's not, you can't like the acting, like the knowing is not something that it's purely can be something on its own and all that. So that's like this is actually one of the key things I would say that like someone should like know exactly as a criticism of the cogito. That's like the first principle and all that. But yeah, in regards to false perceptions, actually, the only thing I can recall like that really like stood up for me on this was that like because I have like a lot of people that make assertions about certainty and truth that it's always very incoherent, and you and I engage with some of these people that like claim that like we can never know things for sure. They would say something about something in regards to that, or that we cannot know things with certain with 100% certainty. We can know them at least with 99% certainty, but not with 100% certainty for some reason. And like this, then like there's a very very obvious questions that comes in. It's like, how do you know that what you have is a false perception if we never grasp that thing that is not falsely perceived in the first place? Like, how do we know the objective if we never really directly grasp the objective in the first place? Which is that like you cannot make that assertion that we have false perceptions without having something to compare that is like not a false perception. And this is a very obvious, like thing that you'll go about. And this is something that you can, me and 4G pointed out to some people about this, and the way that they try to go about this is more just like adding to the claim itself. But yeah, that's kind of the issues in regards to making claims about certainty in that way, which is something that Wilhelmsen pointed out in this section of the book. Yeah. Tomasiga, are you saying something right now?
Sorry, I got disconnected for a second. Um, yeah, no, I mean, the answer that I would give as well to, I mean, okay, how do you know anything if you know if you could have false perceptions? You have to return with them with a question. And here, I think I have a quote. How can I even speak of false perceptions unless I can measure their falsity by a true proposition? Um, and so, like, yeah, there are cases whenever you're sleeping, for example, and you're not, and you think you're awake, um, but you wouldn't know that if you never woke up. You have to wake up and realize that that you were asleep, like, before, in order to know that it's possible for you to um, even that for it to even be possible for you to be deceived and think that you were uh, awake whenever you were asleep. And if you don't know reality, then you're just like destroying your entire basis for believing that it's possible for you to be deceived. Um, and I mean, this is kind of how I was talking to you I think it might have been the last discussion, maybe, where it's like, oh well, how do you respond to the brain in the vat problem? It's like, okay, well, we don't really know that it's possible for somebody to be a brain in the vat. We haven't actually done that. Um, in order to know that it's possible, we would have to actually take somebody's brain, put it in a vat, and somehow measure whether or not they're, experiencing, uh, things that we input into their brain via a computer or whatever, right? Okay, so let's say that we do that. We have that sense data, we have scientific data, and we say, okay, we've proven that a person could be a brain in the vat. And then you say, okay, well, then that means that I could be a brain in the vat, and everything that everything that I've experienced could be false. Well, then your entire experience, you have to doubt your entire experiment that even proved that it's even possible for you to be a brain in the vat in the first place. And then you're back like at square one because you don't have any proof that you can be a brain in the vat because, uh, you're refuting your own evidence for the fact that you could be a brain in the vat. So you can doubt, you can question particular sense experiences, but you can't question all of your sense experiences without it actually being self-defeating. You have to actually just accept that some things are real and some things are evident. And for a Thomist, it's going to start out uh, with the principle of being, that being is. And I'll go over this a little bit since, John, you said you didn't read chapter 4. But he talks about something that's been really helpful to me, that the first principles, such that idealists call the laws of logic, right? I try not to call them the laws of logic because I see them actually as principles of being. What the calling them laws of logic kind of assumes that what we're starting out with are like laws of thought or language. We're starting out in our heads, and these kind of laws of thought are what dictate the way that reality is going to be. Rather, we start out as Thomist with being. And so I say we have principles of being. And the first principle is going to be that being is. And from that, you can say, well, being is not non being. So that's basically the principle of non contradiction. And you can get all of the principles of what idealists call the laws of logic, um, just from the first principle of being. And so, yeah, that's a big part of what he goes into in chapter 4. Um, oh, he also kind of dunks on the idealists and saying that basically idealists want us to become insane. Like the definition of insanity is to uh, deny reality or something like that. I would have to look up the quote. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I remember you sent that in the group chat. That's like, which is I hold that is actually really accurate. When you deny that like reality is like the first thing that comes into the order of things and all that, you're basically just denying reality pretty much from this point on, and which is something that a similar accusation I have when it comes to like denying God, because since God is like being itself and all that, like denial of being, which would entail like denial of God will entail like a denial of reality in that sense. At least that's how I put it there. And one thing I wanted to point out is like the very in regards to the brain and the vat thing is there's a lot of parallels with that with the sort of simulation sort of theory, which is like simulation theory is something that is like propped up by a lot of people that are very like materialist in their sort of metaphysical framework and all that. And this is what I mean about like you'll find that like really the dichotomy of like materialists and idealists it's really they're both participating on a fundamentally I would say like Cartesian starting point in regards to like the body and mind. It's the difference, at least the difference that Facer pointed out on this was that the difference between an idealist and a materialist is that while the idealist can affirm, you know, the thinking thing and the extended thing, the res cogitans or the res extensa. The materialist only just accepts the res extensa, the extended thing, which is that of that of the body, not the thinking thing in itself. And so like yeah, that's kind of what I mean about that. You'll find that there's like a lot of like tendencies of materialism to just end up in the same places as idealists and all that, because they're fundamentally, like coming from the same place, the same principle, the same, really the same first principle on this and all that.
He said something else, and I'm going to be paraphrasing, so maybe I won't get it right, but something along the lines of, okay, well, if you're starting out with anything other than being as your first principle, anything outside of being is going to be non-being. So starting out with non-being as like your first principle is totally incoherent. It just makes no sense.
Yeah, yeah. It's really an untenable principle to hold, and it's you can try to go around it and all that, but you'll probably just end up with like a lot of like and I don't like using this term, but mental gymnastics to try to hold on to it and all. Which is a tendency that we found when we had that one conversation with those two atheists, that even one went to the extent of like denying that that eyes are actually a thing. They're just eyes. How we categorize eyes is just a construct of the mind. Really, it's like, okay, which is essentially just saying that eyes don't exist. They're just like a construct of the mind, really. Like there's really no going around it. That is what they're saying on that occasion. Yeah.
And they'll
Yeah.
deny that and say that you're straw manning, and but yeah, that's what they're saying.
Well, yeah. One of the things that Wilson pointed out in regards to the putting the senses over the mind was that you end up thinking about things very on positivist terms, which is that you'll senses grasp data and then organizes it through with the mind and all that. So you end up with like some sort of positivism. Yeah.
Wait, no, that I was in that conversation. I think he was what's known as a natural kind skeptic, if you know what that means.
Well, he denied the existence of universals and essences.
Well,
I
yeah.
mean, the entire discussion was about whether or not essences exist because it was part of.
Well, I
Uh,
think what he was doing was the essences, for example, he was basically saying that you don't have to categorize it as an I, because I was there for that conversation. He was saying, for instance, you could categorize the purpose of well, this is the issue with denying universals. It kind of goes to this absurd thing where, for instance, you could categorize the purpose of reproduction as like the human being, like a fully mature human being is a sperm, and the body is just a sort of mechanisms for sperm to reproduce. You could categorize reproduction that way, or you could say the purpose of reproduction is to have a. You could say that a normal, like what a normal person thinks, which is that a mature human being is the purpose of growth, or you could say that the purpose of a human body is for the sperm to reproduce itself, right? Like that's what you could say that. Like you could categorize human life as a as say that like we're part of Earth's crust. Like he was saying, like you don't have to categorize the eye as an eye. You could categorize the eye as say part of Earth's crust that is um, within some biological form. Like I think that's what he's saying. Is like you could use like any formalism.
right, but I mean that's. I think that's also probably coming from like an idealist perspective as well,
Because
because go ahead, John.
it forms and essence. Well, I was going to say that because forms and essences don't exist. What's going on here is that you're engaging with a reality that is fundamentally chaotic, and what your mind does is order those things and give it like form. To say like form becomes a construction of the mind. So like there is no such thing as an ordered reality, just a chaotic reality in which we assign orders through it by categorizations of the mind given by the senses.
Yeah,
That's yeah.
it's Kantianism. I mean, that's all it is. Kantian idealism. Um, yeah. So,
Actually, that would be
um,
that would be more aligned with absolute like idealism, according to Wilhelmsen. Like that's yeah, that's what Wilson says. It's like there's because Kant asserts that there is such a thing that's like an external, sort of quote unquote reality, But like an absolute idealist would deny like that like that
True,
there's any
but
sense
I
of
just
like
mean the sense that Kant saw universals as merely a priori ideas inside of our mind that we impose on the world, right? And so that's the same exact thing that Dr. Theo was doing whenever he was talking about eyes. He's just saying, well, in reality, like this categorization of an eye doesn't exist. It's just something that's imposed on the world by us, and we could really just impose whatever we wanted on the world. Which I mean, that kind of goes beyond like Kantian idealism, because Kant would just say it's a priori, and we just kind of like follow our a priori ideas, whereas uh, he is trying to sort of root it in our will. It was just like willpower. We can say these are not ideas.
Well, I think his point was
I
that
mean, these are not
it was, you could have, like, he was saying, well, at what point does a thing become an I? Like, how much sense data is necessary for it to become an I? Um, like what exactly is an I in terms of the evolutionary history of that organ?
I think he
Uh,
would just say that the eye is just like this matter that is arranged in this way, and we just call it an eye. Anyway, Nightmare, you can speak right now.
Oh, hey guys, great discussion. I did really enjoy this book when I read it, and what I found interesting about this section of it, chapter 3, right, was that Williamson is basically trying to bring the assumptions, no pun intended, like the assumptions behind the like dichotomy between like quote unquote critical philosophy and quote unquote dogmatic philosophy. He's trying to like invert those, which is obviously what people don't do when they look at the history of philosophy. And that was really interesting, right? So in other words, he's trying to say that like the assumption that like a non-critical philosophy is dogmatic is wrong, right? And that's why he like leads it into a discussion of the difference between like a postulate, a proof, and something that's evident, because right, like he's trying to argue that like because of this unnecessary bifurcation of man into body and soul, right? The idea that a knowledge of an extramental reality based on sensation being evident becomes absurd only given that assumption. And so he's saying like there really is no reason to make that assumption, right? And so what he wants to say is the critical approach is actually not critical according to the Thomist perspective. Like it itself is making these like unjustified assumptions about how we know things, right? And that's when he gets into what you were talking about, John, earlier, this like double abstraction away from the actual experience of thought, right? Where like you have the subject thinking, the object of which you're thinking, and then like the thought itself, which like exists as like a relation between the two. And he's like, Wilhelmsen is arguing like the only way this critical turn becomes like obvious or like inescapable is if you like take away the man thinking and the thing he's thinking of, right? And you're just like, all you have that remains is like pure abstraction of thought. And then Wilhelmsen is like, does that sound intuitive? Like to say, to just assume that is like the default experience of thinking. He finds that to be like quite dogmatic. He's like, where are you getting this assumption from? And so he's trying again, like I found it very interesting that he's trying to invert this relationship. He's like, no, like saying that the senses are evident is not just like assuming that the world exists. He's saying that like, given that the relationship between body and soul in man is like this substantial unity, the Thomist or like the pre-critical philosopher doesn't really have a problem just finding the existence of the world outside his mind evident, right? Because he's like, the entire man, the composite body and soul man, has access to like all of the experiences of the world, like including sensation. And so like I feel like ultimately what what his argument was in this chapter, I guess, where he kind of begins this to get through the rest of the book, is like the critical turn is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's like once you split man into just like this dichotomy of just body and soul that are like fundamentally unrelated to each other, and then you say, okay, now how do I bridge the gap that I just created between the soul and the body in order to prove that my sensations are verifiable and actually point at something real outside my mind? How do I do that? And then they're like, oh, well, it's actually impossible. And then Wilhelm said, like, yeah, it's impossible because like you just made it impossible.
Yeah, pretty much is like the problem was literally just fabricated by the way that things were just, put forward like that. This is something that I tried to explain to a friend of mine. Well, he was very Humean in his approach. Is like I was explaining to him that like a lot of like modern philosophy tends to be like trying to answer questions to problems that they created themselves and all that. And he kind of accused me of just like just saying that like, oh, I'm just trying to be obscure or something like that. You're just kind of like not trying to deal with the actual problems. It's like, no, these problems don't exist. Like the problem of is in odd, the bridging of is and odd. It's not an issue within Thomistic tradition because it never even like separated those things in the first place. When you understand what teleology is, and like this is a trend that I find in regards to modern philosophy, that it tends to like create like a lot of the problems that it's trying to answer it was like created on its own.
Well, yeah, and you guys were talking about the ending of the chapter when he addresses what was it? False perceptions, right? The objection based on false perceptions, and it seems like that's when he really gets to the heart of the matter, because what he's saying is like this argument of false perceptions rests on the assumption, again, like not justifiable in his view, that the mind, the intellect can somehow set up for itself a criteria for sensation. So in other words, one order can come up with a means of testing the other order's validity. And then Wilhelm says, like, that is a problem that you created. So the fact that you can't do it isn't really surprising, because you're the one that made that conceptual distinction in the first place, right? So like you can't use like an intellectual criteria to determine sensation, because the objects of sensation are just given to us in experience as actually existing. Like that, like you guys were talking about that earlier, that like existence is not, it escapes conceptual categorization in this way. And so he like when he gets to the false perception, he brings up that criticism, which seems to be like the heart at the end of the argument, where it's like, you're trying to set up a parameter or a test for sensation within the intellectual order. And like, I guess almost like you're not respecting the integrity of sensation as like a fundamental part of how humans experience the world. And you're trying to deduce and derive all of it just from like within your own head. And then the fact that you find this to be an impossible task, Wilhelmsen doesn't find this to be like impressive. He just finds it to be like a condition of the very parameters that you set up at the beginning of the discussion.